Welcome to Confronting Anti-Black Racism. Before we get deep into the conversation, I want us to acknowledge the land that we're on. My name is Dobijoki Manola Brinji. I am a Blenda woman from South Sudan, a visitor on Turtle Island. I would like us to honor our Indigenous brothers and sisters today, as they also continue to fight the fight against racism and the implications of colonization. I'm currently in Markham, Ontario, which is the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of New Credit First Nation. I'd like you to remember that regardless of where you are situated in Canada, you are on Indigenous land and you have a responsibility to respect the land and its people. On May 7, 2020, the City Symposium held a webcast on quality education where I spoke on my doctoral research on Indigenous African-centered education. Moments before I was to speak and share my work, someone joined the panelist chat room and wrote over 70 times in bold letters, "Kill all niggers," evidently directed to Dr. Melanie Ann or myself. That was an attempt to silence us, an experience that Black people face every single day. This is why we chose to have this symposium, to confront anti-Black racism that we experience in London, Ontario, in Canada, and on a global level. We planned this before the murder of Brother George Floyd, before the global outrage began, before the protest, because these acts of violence and hate happen to us every day. To be alive is an act of resistance to Black bodies. We are 6 years into the International Decade for People of African Descent, a decade observed by the United Nations that recognizes people of African descent as a distinct group whose human rights must be promoted and protected. We continue to experience barriers in addressing anti-Black racism in Canada when our leaders deny the existence of deep-rooted colonial histories, hundreds of years of slavery, and the imperialistic nature of the ways in which systems operate. We continue to experience these barriers when members of the police force misuse their power, when the school system plays a role in miseducating Black students. Alongside the ongoing varied battles of Black people, the experiences that Black people experience daily, the COVID-19 pandemic has further magnified the racial systemic inequalities that persist in Canada. The protests have purpose and intention. It is not a trend. Activism for Black lives is not a trend, because regardless of whether folks are protesting alongside Black communities or not, we are still at risk. In other words, and in the words of Angela Davis, civil rights activist, in a society that is racist, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. I will now pass over the mic to Dr. Melanie Ann.
Thank you, Dobijoki. I hope you all had the chance to hear her set this whole thing up for us on CBC Radio. The segment is also available. It was yesterday, because she did a beautiful job then of really taking us through some of the history and some of her own experiences that led to this moment. So I'm so grateful that Dobijoki, this was all your idea, and look how it has come to fruition. And this is a time to celebrate the hard work that you put into making this happen. So I really appreciate you tonight as my co-host. So everybody, you may know me already. You know what I do here. You know that I always introduce the format. But today's format is a little bit different, because what we're going to do is the questions this time actually come from you. So my job is quite easy tonight. All I need to do is read questions that came from you. And we had over 300 questions. So it was amazing, the response. And so we're so happy to have this conversation where you get to listen to some of those answers that you might have been looking for. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by reading everybody's biographies so that you get a chance to know a little bit more about each of our panelists. Then I'm going to ask one question to the entire panel, and each one is going to have the chance to answer from their perspective. And again, that's a question that one of you actually submitted, so you'll recognize it if you hear your question asked. And then we'll go through different questions for each panelist. We'll do that for a few rounds. And then the final round is the same question, again from one of you, for everyone to answer. All right, so let's get started. I'm also going to start with our first biography, and it is Colette Chapman. Colette Chapman is a clinical social worker in London, Ontario, and she was on CBC Radio this morning, so I hope that you caught that as well, and the segment is also available. So as in her work as a clinical social worker, she actually has her own counseling practice and has been working in the field of child welfare for the past 20 years, and now holds a position as a supervisor within a child welfare organization. She is the past president of the Congress of Black Women, which my mom belonged to, and the current president of the African Caribbean Soccer Club in London, Ontario. Dobi Joki, do you want to introduce Nyaboy?
So our next panelist is Nyaboy Gatbell. She is a South Sudanese Canadian currently living in Calgary. She is an undergraduate student at the University of Calgary. Along with her studies, she also supports the Parman Center, which focuses on healing the maternal line of African Black families. She's also the author of a book called The Fire Within, a poetry book in Thoknath and English, which explores the pain of South Sudanese refugees in the aftermath of trauma. Welcome. Okay, and it seems like we lost Melanie Ann there, so I'll proceed with our bios. Leroy Hibbert is the Multicultural Outreach Coordinator at Luso Community Services, where his responsibilities include facilitating workshops, presentations, and training on race relations, cultural diversity, and awareness to youth, parents, professionals, and community groups in the nonprofit sector and profit sectors. Following Leroy, we have Councillor Ariel Kayabaga. She's a mother, London City Councillor, community activist, and passionate city builder. Councillor Kayabaga's family left her home country, Burundi, in the midst of a civil war. After arriving in Canada, Councillor Kayabaga faced many of the challenges inherited in most new Canadian stories: insecure housing, precarious employment, and unfamiliar systems to navigate. Councillor Kayabaga's story is one of breaking barriers, overcoming adversity, and defying expectations. Lastly, we have Melvin Wright. Melvin Wright is a community development practitioner with over 20 years of experience leading global health and community development projects and campaigns in 4 countries globally, as well as in Nunavut and Ontario. Melvin currently sits on the board of directors with Pillar Nonprofit in London, Ontario, and is a founding member of the Black London Network. He's passionate about finding creative solutions that are grounded in equity, justice, and solidarity. Welcome, panelists. How are you all? So we will go ahead with our first question. And as Melanie Ann stated, these questions are presented by all the guests. And so we would like to thank you again for submitting your questions. What we'll do, I'll ask the first question. We'll start by Nyaboy answering, and then we'll continue on. So our first question is, please share your perspective on the presence of anti-Black racism in London or your respective city, the work being done to combat anti-Black racism locally, and how to be a part of that work. Nyaboy, please feel free to answer.
So I'm currently based in Calgary, where I live and study. So I kind of checked out what we have going on here. What I realized is a lot of the stuff that we do is like to deal with the symptoms of anti-Blackness. And I feel like we need more than that, because if we can't talk about the root and the birth of anti-Blackness, where it was born, how it was constructed, and how it was perpetuated, and how it's being fed within our societies, then it really doesn't make sense. So I kind of feel like the more we deal with the symptoms of the problem, we won't actually have the type of healing that we need. So I feel like a lot of the conversation is to deal with the symptoms, but none of it is about getting power, because at the end of the day, like if we don't have power over what happens to us, then all the conversations that are centered around our Blackness won't really make sense. So that's just my opinion.
Thank you, Nyaboy, for answering that. And I think I also agree with you in the sense that recognizing the symptoms of anti-Black racism in order to address it. We'll continue with Melvin. Feel free to answer the question. I'll restate the question, which is asking to share your perspective on the presence of anti-Black racism in London, the work that's being done to combat anti-Black racism, and how people could actually be a part of that.
I hope everyone can hear me. You know, I think for me that this was you know, I think it was a great first question. I think to get the elephant out of the room, for me, I think racism does exist within London. Let's be candid. Let's be honest. And I think for me, I think as to tell a story or to weave a tale, right? My family and I, we moved here from Nunavut 3 years ago. And part of that moving, we did our research before coming to London. You know, we looked at housing prices, migration patterns, population growth, etc. My wife is she's a regional planner, so we did our homework. But then also another piece that we looked at was we just Googled racism and London, Ontario. Right, and the thing is, for me, I think what strikes me is that how many other people, aside from I would say Black people and Indigenous people, actually look at and ask that question first, right? Mm-hmm. If I'm going into a space, what are the racial implications? What are the physical threats that I may face? What are the institutional threats that may rise up? What is the history of pain, hurt, and also death within that space that I'm planning to move to? And also, what are the implications for my children at the same time? Because that is also a very critical question, because children going into that institution, you see, and I think for me, many things. This is part of our reality of Black people, and we must always ask these questions, and these questions emerge from a place that is within history. It's within our recent history. It's part of our blood memory, right? At the same time, because race and racism has consequences: physical, mental, metaphysical, spiritual, structural, and so on and so forth. So we must always ask these questions coming in. When we settled, meaning moving into London, we really looked around where our community was. Where were people who looked like us, who laughed like us, who ate similar things, who understood some of those unspoken languages that are part of your culture and your identity. And you know, I think that started a journey of really intentionally seeking out people. For me, this may be pulling the curtain away, but one of the things that we do often as Black people, especially Black men, we have this thing called the universal greeting of the Black man. I see you, you see me. I don't know you, but I'll say hi to you, right? And I think for me, it was really interesting coming to London and not getting that gaze reciprocated, right? And for me, that really implied that individuals in this space had probably experienced some sort of trauma from being in this white space, right? And were hesitant to see themselves what they look like in white space, right? So often people will either ignore the gaze or look away or simply look through you, right? And I think there's a history of trauma here from a community standpoint that needs to be addressed. But I think there are many cultural organizations here within London. There are people fighting every day to carve out space for themselves within organizations. But again, the same thing. I sit on a board of directors. When I was, in my 9 to 5, oftentimes I'm the only one sitting at that leadership table, and there's no one else, right? And sometimes it can be exhausting being the only individual speaking on those issues of equity, inclusion, diversity, and actually thinking about things differently, thinking through things differently, and arriving at a different set of solutions that are not grounded in hegemony. This is how we've always done it. This is how we will always do it. This is how it's always been done, right? So, but I think things are happening within London. I think the Black community is speaking up. It is organizing. It is mobilizing. It is becoming much more diverse. It is becoming much more nuanced in many ways, and really understanding that there's work to be done. And I think people are becoming unafraid to roll their sleeves up and actually to say, hey, let's set aside some of those differences and let's get some things done, and let's start moving forward as a community, and especially as a whole.
Thank you. So I disappeared because my computer decided to do updates. And because it's my institutional, thanks Western computer, I had no choice over when those updates happen. But I'm back, and I know Dobi Joki was fabulous. And I think it's my turn to ask Councillor Kayabaga the same question. So Councillor Kayabaga, could you share your perspective on the presence of anti-Black racism in London and the work being done to combat anti-Black racism locally, and how to be part of the work?
So it's a three-part question. I'll start with the first part, which is, do I think that there is anti-Blackness or anti-Black racism in the City of London? My answer is yes. I think that when we're talking about racism in the City of London, and we're not talking about the past, we're really doing a disservice to the community. In order to understand where we're going, we must understand where we're coming from and how far we've come. So there is so many history of Black people in this city that is still yet to be uncovered. Lots of dark history that is still yet to be shared, to be talked about. We often talk about Victoria Park, how it used to be a segregated school, and many people here in London, Ontario do not have that information. In fact, and Colette Chapman will speak on this a little bit, there was a plaque that was at the park, and it's been gone for quite a bit of time. And just to kind of, give more of, I guess, a story that is more relatable. Sorry, just a second. I apologize. It's COVID, we're sharing spaces and things like this happen. So, I was born in Burundi, and Burundi is predominantly Black African people. I grew up with I saw Black teachers, Black lawyers, Black presidents, Black everything. So when I came to Canada, I don't think I really understood what racism was. In school, we learned about colonization. We learned about slavery. We learned about a lot of things that were on a higher level, but not really anything to do with like racism in your city or in your space or in your workplace or in schools, because we didn't have to deal with that. So when I came here, the first time I had a racist encounter, it had to be, actually for a long time, it had to be other people telling me that experience was racist. And for people to be able to point it out, you can only imagine that this had to be an overt situation. It couldn't be microaggressions. And there was a time in London where, even calling someone the N-word or, yelling someone across the street and telling them to go back to their country was much more acceptable. And if we look at the numbers, we do have a really high hate crime here in London. And so, answering that question, racism it exists in London. I learned it in this city. I didn't know what racism was until I came here. And I've been working towards eradicating it ever since, because the experiences that I had as a child, without really truly even understanding what I was going through, I don't want those experiences for my kids or any other person's kids. So the work that's being done, a lot of work since, I'm going to say in the 2000s, and later the 2000s, I'm going to say 2014, 2015, 16 is where I start seeing people rally around anti-racism. The diversity and inclusion at the City of London was born around that time. And we also had Councillor Mohammed Salah, who's not on the line with us today, who ran as a Black Muslim man. And he can also talk about some of the racist experiences that he experienced. So everybody has paved the way. We have also had Councillor a past councillor who was the councillor for Ward 12. He came before us. He was the first Black man to be elected on council. So everybody comes in and paves the way and chips away into the work that we've been doing to eradicate racism in the city of London. But at this point where we're at with COVID, and the death of George Floyd and everybody just, working towards, eradicating anti-Blackness across the world. It's not just in North America and Canada or the United States, it's literally across the world. People who don't have anti-Blackness in their countries are standing up with us. So I think that right now we've seen a lot more work be done. There is, the Black Lives Matter movement that has been born. There's a connection of different Black organizations that are working together to make sure that we're holding policymakers accountable, which means me, and I'm doing my part on my end, and many other. And we're talking about looking at racism at a deeper level, more than just educating and awakening people's consciousness. The first part has already actually been done. A lot of people are aware now. We're awake. We're not oblivious to racism. And a lot of educating has been done and continues to be done. That's the first step. Now we're going to have to go into a new phase of making sure that the work that we're doing doesn't stay at a high level of just talking, but we're going into deeper of the policies. So if you want to be part of the work, there are a couple of things that I can suggest that you can look at. One, you need to get to know who are your elected officials, so that you can understand how there is a lack of diverse leadership across the city altogether. You need to get to know some of the policies that affect you. When we're talking about racism, we can even trace it back to when segregation ended. Segregation and the phase of segregation ended, but a new phase of discrimination, anti-Blackness started through different policies that had to do with transit, housing, access to healthcare, access to, schools, education. And we can go into the details of every single part of our lives, like any makeup of our lives, whether we drive or we get on the highway, the neighborhoods we live in, where we have access to food, where we have access to restaurants, businesses in our communities, and we can start seeing how deepened and how embedded racism was into the creation of our system. So if you want to be part of it, I think you need to start looking at those policies and those levels of, every single area, whether it be arts, whether it be, healthcare, maternal care. We need to start looking deeper into how every single policy was created in a system that was discriminative towards Black, Indigenous, people of color, and just barriers to a lot of people who are in that group. So it's important that we start having those conversations. We move past to the education of knowing that racism is real. Racism is real. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't real. But what we need to start talking about now is how some of the policies that we're dealing with continue to affect us past the conversation of how can I be a better person? You are awake now. We are doing better at that part. Now let's work together to make sure that these policies do not continue to suffocate us. And the way that COVID has shifted our lives, it's actually going to remain that we have to change the way the system works in order to move forward.
Well, thank you so much for that thorough answer. And I think it's super important to mention what you mentioned in regards to getting to know your city councilors and getting to understand policy and knowing how to be a part in that way. Next, we're going to have Colette answer this question. Please feel free to tell me if I need to rephrase the question or
no, I think I got it.
Okay.
Ariel and Councillor Ariel Kayabaga and Melvin said some things that hit on spot. I think one of the things I'll agree with Melvin, I've been living in London for about 20 years, actually this month, and I come from Montreal. Prior to that, I'm born in Guyana, South America. And I'm going to agree with I don't remember who said it, but one of the things is, I came here when I was young, but certainly I wasn't aware of these episodes of racism that we're talking about, right? I think for myself, it probably became something internalized when I was younger, right? And that's how I kind of moved through high school with my identity and some struggles related to that, right? And the messages that were so on the ground that were given, right? I don't remember if I've gotten, you know, the straight out names or stuff, but certainly I remember the internalizing of things which I experienced. One of the things when I moved here, we'll agree with Melvin with this, one of the things when I decided to move here for work was I needed to know how many Black people lived here in London, Ontario. And I remember asking my interviewers this, and they had no idea. Right. Anyway, I did go and I think I did Google up and everything as well. I don't know if it was Google, but I did look it up as well to see what was going on because I needed to know what I was walking into here. And it's very different when you come to a city, a country, wherever, where you do not see yourself readily. So when I left Montreal, we know people are here, people are there, and it's just a custom, what I'm accustomed to. So when I moved here, it was like, where are the Black people? And you have to do this active search, right, to find them, right? And it's active. You have to find where they are, and that's how I began to build my my own community for myself, and how I began to build my own connections as well. I think one of the things, and you know, and I remember moving here, and I don't remember at one point, but I certainly remember 20 years ago moving here and being quite well aware that anti-Black racism was live and well in London, Ontario. And I remember hearing about, I think it was Yaphet Robinson, who had gotten killed. And I think, and Leroy, you can correct me with this, you've been around a bit longer than I have. And I think that was something intentional. And I think if I remember, it was along the lines of being a racial crime for this youth that passed away. And his memory is always remembered every year through the Congress of Black Women and the scholarship that is given out. What Ariel talked about with the school, we had done the Congress at that point had done some research, because we very well know we live in a community right here where there is a history of Black history here in London that is not visible, right? So one of the things we wanted to do was to make it visible. So as Ariel mentioned, in Victoria Park, there was a school there which actually housed Black, and I think it was Irish children as well that went to the same school. And we created a plaque. And that plaque was there, and then it wasn't there. It honestly wasn't there. And no one is crazy if they thought they saw a plaque but can't remember there was a plaque, because we have the pictures and that plaque disappeared. And I don't believe anyone knows where that plaque went to. And I want to say, I can't recall everything, but certainly the city was involved in terms of putting up that plaque, and I don't know if they were involved in putting it down. And actually, up to today, I was inquiring with the Congress, how do we get this plaque back up, right? So these removals of things that are very historic to our Black community, I think you want to think about what's the message that you're giving, right? Keep our history hidden, make us non-existent, right? And these are the things that are being perpetuated through this system in terms of anti-Black racism, right? I think one of the other things Ariel talked about that I have to agree with is around the policies, right? In terms of getting aware. Being aware of what the policies are, being aware of the history of your policies, right? Being aware of your immigration policies, going back, why were they, what was the purpose of those? How are they still sustaining some of those structures in place? So your policies is where some of your structural racism lies as well. And always think about who's benefiting from this. But within London, yes, anti-Black racism is here. We saw it at Western, right, with the teacher. We saw it there. We saw it 20 years ago. We saw it with the banana on the ice. Sometimes when things happen and I read the comments in the newspapers, I am struck by people's comments, how blatant and open people are. And sometimes I'm just shocked. I don't know why, but sometimes I'm just shocked, right? So we've had those issues right here in London, right? And I know people like to always look to our neighbors in the South, in the States, to compare us to, but we don't have to look that far because it's right here, right? 384,000 people living here, according to what's out there in terms of who lives in London. It's right here in London. You don't have to look far.
Thank you, Colette. I was just writing down what you said about that you don't have to look far because it's right here. So thank you for that. I was just writing that down. So Leroy, you've been waiting, I know, to answer this question. So I'm going to do it one more time because like Councillor Kayabaga said, it's a three-part question. So Leroy, please share your perspective on the presence of anti-Black racism in London, the work being done to combat anti-Black racism locally, and how to be part of the work.
Okay, well, let me answer the question. Question number one, point number one is yes, it does exist. See, there's something about having darker skin that shapes the way a person moves throughout the world. And you cannot live beyond what you've been taught. So if you don't know any better, like Maya Angelou said, sometimes you don't do any better. But my personal experience, because I was here since the 70s. So I went to elementary school here, went to high school here, I went to college here as well. And throughout my journey, I've experienced different things. And it's been quite interesting. And it's still happening today. So racism does exist generally, but also the form of anti-Black racism also exists. And I think we have to continue to name that for that to be addressed in the proper way. We can't look at it as they're just having a bad day. Did they really mean it? What did you do to cause that? Maybe you did. We see, for people that are from our persuasion, now I can't speak for everybody, but when these things do happen, a lot of times people that are not from our community, they always look at their intent. We don't necessarily are concerned with the intent. We are looking at the impact. That's what we want to deal with, not just, I didn't mean it. The hurt is still there that has to be addressed. So, for example, you know, I actually, in school, my teacher had all of our students in the class journal of the day. So we had to buy a journal from a store, it had to be hardcover, and he wanted us just to journal throughout the day what happened at school. And you can keep that as a keepsake for yourself. So all the students had to do that and we were being marked on it. So I said, okay, I wasn't too much of a journaler, but I did it anyway. But November 19th, 1987, I actually wrote in my journal that there was a teacher in my school that called another student a chocolate figurine. Then a student, same day, in my school, told me that he was going to dress me up as Aunt Jemima because he thought that was humorous for some degree. Then another student said, who's quote unquote supposed to be my friend, you know, Leroy, I'm just paraphrasing this, but I'm going to melt you down into a black hockey puck because, you know, Black people can't skate. All these, what's called, if you want to call it microaggressions, you want to call it micro assaults, micro insults, micro invalidation, however you want to call it, that still bothersome. And I asked myself throughout that, why did I pick out that element throughout the entire day to write about? Because of the impact, not the intent. It's because of the impact it had on me that I had to document that. And then very quickly as well, you know, when we had the Black Lives Matter protest that happened downtown, I don't want to call this person out because I do not want to embarrass her, but I heard her mention this as an experience that she had. One of the organizers, everything was done. She was packing up, putting some things in the car, putting some signs away. And after this entire march was completed, a woman of not her background, a Caucasian woman, I believe, walked up to her after the event was done that day and said, "Nothing changes. I'm still afraid of you." So you kind of look at that and you kind of think it's bleeding into everything we do as a community. I want to quickly move ahead because I know we've got other speakers as well, but I'll just kind of tie it up together by saying, what can we do? I know I may have missed a point, but I don't want to belabor because I know that time is of the essence. I think what we can do is, before you take a stand, I think you first have to take a seat and amplify the voices of the people that need to be heard. And that's what I'd like to conclude with.
Well, Lyra, thank you so much for that. And I think that's a perfect way to conclude and transition. You mentioned impact, not the intent. I think that's really important. And what you mentioned, take a seat before standing up. I think this is key in understanding how anti-Black racism affects people. I'm going to proceed with the next question, and it's directed to Nyaboy Getbel. So the question is, what is true allyship? And how can allies leverage their privilege to better support Black communities and predominantly white spaces?
Just unmuting myself. So with that question, I think first the person that wants to be an ally has to accept our humanity, because sometimes you can't really help or support people that you don't see as human, that are people that you don't see fully as human beings. What we're looking for is not sympathy, or we're not looking for people to feed into the victimhood complex that we have been kind of confined into. We want like a human to human relationship, so we can eradicate these issues that are holding us back. So some of the speakers have mentioned the impact, structural impact, and like things like policies. The thing is, the truth of the matter is, the white world is fully aware of what they have done to us as Black people. They know. But what it comes down to, they do not care. And the reason why they do not care is because our liberation, it has a huge cost, right? If you look at, for example, the African continent, if we were to have control of our own resources, our own shores, our own airlines, then the economic stuff that has been going on is going to have an impact on the rest of the world that has been benefiting from our turmoil that we have been put in purposely. So a lot of the conversation is, do you really think I'm human? Do you think I'm worthy of wealth? Do you think I'm worthy of protection and just humanity? Because if you don't think I'm worth those things, then true allyship can't really happen. Because if you think that you need to be number one and I should be number two, if that's the only way that we can coexist, then you don't really want my freedom. You don't want my well-being. You just want to soothe your own guilt by going to marches, by going to meetings, and by some people are writing books. Like whatever you can do to ease your own conscience, your own guilty conscience, that's what you will do. But then to the public, it will look like you're doing something, but in reality, you're just soothing your own guilt. Because the truth of the matter is, from the policies, globally, things have been done to systematically make sure that Black people do not rise, that they do not prosper. It is intentional. So when we talk about privilege, I want people to understand that privilege is not innate, it's constructed. So you have to look at the social construct within your own society that have produced conditions for you to be privileged and for me to be not. So I don't want someone to feel like, oh, because I have white skin, I was just born privileged. No, you were not born privileged. No one is born privileged. Things are done by the patriarchal society that we live in to ensure who eats and who doesn't eat. So for me, a true ally would be someone who, number one, you have to accept my humanity. You can't look at my dark complexion and think that I'm subhuman, I'm part of the animal planet, whatever narrative you have concocted to make sure that you feel some type of way about me, it has to die. You have to accept my humanity. And until you can accept that, nothing you do will make sense, because I don't need someone who's gonna nurse my symptoms. I want to eradicate the whole thing. So you need to accept my humanity, that's one. Number two, you need to revisit your history, because your history glorifies one narrative. It does not tell the whole truth of the story. You know, like I always say, You know, when we lost Egypt to Persia in 525 BC, it didn't happen in one day. It was 10,000 years of our ancestors resisting to the people on the shore, 10,000 years of resistance. But when you look at history, that is not told. So when we look at the history of Black Canadians, they did not just end up, or even like, so in this case would be Black and African Canadians, we did not just get here by accident. Things have been done systematically to make sure that we do not prosper. So a true ally would look at the structural things that have been put in place by their government to ensure that I don't prosper. Also, I would recommend that you read. Like, please read. I'm not here to educate you. Like, it's a lot of work. So since we all have access to the internet, we all have access to libraries, I want people that really want to humanize us, like, please read history that dignified me. My history did not begin with slavery. I had dynastic rule. Learn about me before you came and touched my soil. Humanize me in that way. Understand who I was before you came and touched me. Then you can understand that my state of regression right now was systematic. It was done on purpose. I was not born in a place of destitute. It was done on purpose. Until you can dignify my past, you cannot really be part of my future. So that's what I would want an ally to understand, that first you have to see me as a human being. Because if you can't do that, nothing else will make sense. And also do your own homework. Like, do the work. It's not Black people's responsibility to educate you about our own humanity. In fact, sometimes it can be dehumanizing that you call me for things to tell you, like, hey, I'm human. You know I'm human. You just don't want to accept my humanity because it's a cost to accepting I'm human, because then things like reparation have to come through. You have to account for the pillaging of the continent. You have to account for all types of slavery that have gone on. So there's a consequence to the actions that have been done. But the reality is, you have to dignify my past to be part of my future. If you cannot see me as a human being prior to your entrance into my life or into my content or to my current history, then you're not really ready for that type of relationship.
Wow. Thank you, Nirboy. I mean, you said, you're not here to educate us. So I just wanted to thank you for giving me that education, because I've never, ever heard anyone speak more profoundly about allyship. So I wanted to thank you for that, because I definitely just learned something from our first question. Melvin, I'm going to turn to you. I want to know, what is your take on kind of the other side of this, which is allyship fatigue? And in what ways does allyship fatigue affect the plight of Black communities?
You want the truth?
That's what we're here for, the truth.
The thing, I think it took me a while to think about this one. And it took me back to, I was thinking about a bunch of different things, and I think what really came to mind is that I think what is first, I think it's got to be, if you are not coming from a place that is about self-examination, self-interrogation, as a so-called ally, or as a non-Black person, let's be straight. I think if you're not coming from a place of self-examination, self-interrogation, and if you're not willing to set aside a set of assumptions about a people, place, and space, and give up a particular dogma that you've held on to, and a particular structure that has propped you up and has supported you, right? Then I think then this entire exercise, you can get fatigued by it, right? Because if there is no self-reflection and self-interrogation, then it becomes passing, right? Because I think that kind of self-reflection and self-interrogation, I think personally, I think it is akin to a form of death. Okay, and what I mean is, it is death of a particular system and a particular way of doing things, right? And I think, but at the end of the day, is that is what it is. It is death to a particular structure, right? And a particular set of beliefs about a people, a place, and a space. But we have faced historically and presently a different kind of death, a physical death, right? You see, so the two things are not equal. And I think at some point, non-Blacks need to move beyond being spectators, right? And become participants in the elimination of anti-Black racism. There's a huge difference. You can be a spectator, right? You can stand, you can observe, you can support, you can wave a flag, right? You can say, yes, I agree, right? But to become a participant is a different level of engagement. And the question for me is how many people are actually willing and able and in a space to actually take that next step. And if you haven't done that self-reflection again, and that self-interrogation, and literally, because if you read the biography of Malcolm X, I think one of the things that is amazing is time and time again, he goes through experiences where his belief systems are called into question, and they die time and time again. Okay, and it's only through that death of his belief system that he's given the ability to arise and create something new. I always say we must reach a point where we begin to speak ourselves as African people back into existence, right? Because our existence has been spoken for us far too long, right? Right, and that is within our naming, our voice, our language, our stories, our songs, our ways of moving through the world, our ways of seeing the world, right? And unless our allies are willing to, those who call themselves allies, are willing to allow this to happen, right? But then it's far beyond a point. It's not about you allowing anything to happen at this point. It has to happen. Because things cannot continue the way things have been going. Anytime we have this conversation about this, what is the post-COVID reality going to look like? I personally have no interest in going back to the way things were. Okay? I personally have zero interest in going back to the way that things were. Change needs to happen, and change is happening. Okay? But I think there is so much in terms of this allyship piece. And again, if you are not willing to put the work in, and if you are not prepared to see everything in terms of that you hold dear to that system and that structure that has propped you up, to see that structure die and fall down, right? Right? And I think in many ways, sometimes I feel there's a lack of imagination. So many of us within this greater society, we can't imagine anything else but what exists now, right? Like sometimes I'm at organizations and we're having these discussions and we can talk about all the change and the social justice. And I'm always like, but wait a second, do you have the tools and the language to do these things? Okay? Or are you going to try to use, as Audre Lorde said, are you going to try to use the master's tools to disassemble the master's house? How is that possible? Unless we are prepared and willing to create a new set of tools, a new language, and a new way of seeing things, things will perpetually stay the same. And allies have to understand. They have to, unless you are willing to disassemble that system, okay, that's what allyship is. It is nothing less, not a quarter less. Not like that is what it has to be. So so I think if you're fatigued, then I don't think that allyship fatigue is I don't think you're committed or ready for what is next. And I think allyship is about true commitment, and it's about who's ready to make that march and to walk hand in hand and say, let's get this done. Let's make some fundamental and some systemic changes.
Thank you so much for that, Melvin. You mentioned self-examination, interrogation. You also talked about assembling the system, and that is key to allyship. So I thank you for that. We're going to go to Colette. Colette, how does anti-Black racism show up in the mental health profession? And what are some suggestions in how mental health practitioners can address their own biases and work towards anti-Black racism?
Okay, so I think when I think about anti-Black racism, there's a couple things probably people need to acknowledge first. That racism is a social detriment is probably the first step. That racism is racial trauma, which should be included in your trauma approach of working with people, okay? People need to acknowledge that anti-Black racism shows up as, I think Melvin says, as microaggressions and macroaggressions as well. And that sometimes within the healthcare system, anti-Black racism is also connected with stress. So it can show up in some of these ways, okay? There's an impact that people have to be able to recognize that it has on the mental health as well. And I think one of the things I was thinking about with respect to this is that when you're doing work in the mental health field, I am not sure out there how many people actively practice from an anti-Black racism perspective or actually brings race into your interventions that you're doing with people. Okay, so that would be one of the ways, the lack of even acknowledging that that is an issue for Black people. That's one of the ways it shows up. It also leads to what I was talking about before, that internalization, right? Because when you begin to internalize some of those things, we're talking about the potential for anxiety, the potential for depression, and what that has in our system and how we carry that forward as well. And one of the things Melvin talked about is racial fatigue, right? And that's also embedded within anti-Black racism. And I think Naya Boy talked about it too, having to always be explaining your stories and such as well. It also shows up in various ways: lack of access to healthcare service providers, lack of acknowledgement that issues that relate to colonization has an impact on our mental health, that anti-Black racism intersects with interpersonal, institutional, and internal factors as well needs to be acknowledged. There's structural factors of anti-Black racism as well that need to be acknowledged. Gaps as well needs to be acknowledged. And there's also impact on Black professionals with respect to that. I think a lack of understanding as well, as I was saying, from people who are giving services, they don't have that cultural lens or cultural view to also take into consideration in providing that service. I think one of the things I think about in terms of strategies on how to deal with this is that exactly what is it? Acknowledge racism, anti-Black racism, make it a part of your conversation when you see your client, make it a part of counseling, make it a part of when you're going to the emergency department. I remember something that stood with me years ago when I went to a doctor at the hospital here in London, and I was so floored. This doctor talked to me about my ancestors and remembering that when my ancestors were brought over, the types of food that we had to eat on the slave ships and all of these things. And I was actually stunned that he brought this up back to me in connection to my own health system. I think one of the things that would be nice to see in terms of strategy, collection of identity-based data in terms of when people are receiving services, right? That's how you fill your gaps. That's where you know your gaps are, right? So you can get funding for those gaps. So it's identity-based data. Check the service and the needs. Hold providers accountable as well for anti-Black racism. That's linked with something Melvin talked about, which I can pick up at another time. We need those spaces to be able to collaborate. I think the other part is people to be aware of how race, gender, and culture intersects as well within the mental health. You can go on and on, because then you get into implicit biases, and those biases that just affect people's interaction with their doctors, nurses, or whoever as well, and being aware of how those show up in decision making, right, for our kids, right, adults as well. I was reading something where it was talking about that, what was it, something about schizophrenia. It was actually about schizophrenic, and about Blacks being prescribed more medication than anything else with respect to being diagnosed with schizophrenia. And there needs to be a commitment from our organizations to actually want to make shifts, right? And again, you get back to that structure, right? Which is either you're going to do some very specific, direct, and targeted recruitment. You're going to make space for people in your organizations who look like the people you serve as well, right? You're going to be deliberate in your conversations as well to be able to address some of the issues. You can do, if depending on your organization, you can do surveys in terms of getting sense of belonging of where people are at, if they actually feel that they belong within your organization. So it takes a deliberation to be very deliberate, and it takes a lot of courage to be able to do these shifts. And as Melvin says, the shifts need to occur, because I don't believe as we move forward, we're going back to what we were.
Thank you, Colette. That was great. I really like the way that you talked about making race and racism part of your conversation in counseling. And like my background is in psychology as well, and it's funny how little you see it. And I think that you actually pinpointed why that was, which is that people who lead these organizations and even lead these schools of thought do not look like the people they serve. And so I thought that was a really important point. So thank you for bringing that up. Councillor Kayabaga, I'm wondering what advice or feedback you have for rural communities and areas that lack racial diversity and therefore believe that they do not have a role to play in confronting Black racism.
So I thought this question was interesting, and that it was directed to me. I've never lived in rural communities. I've always lived in London, and when I moved from London, I went to Ottawa and then came back. So, however, I do have some thoughts or ideas around, racism in rural communities, and I think it's also very different from the rural communities in the United States versus the rural communities here in Canada. A lot of Black people can be found in rural communities, whether they're segregated or there's not that many who live in rural communities in the States, but a smaller number of Black people can be found in rural communities here in Canada, to my knowledge. So, I mean, I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier. We need to establish better health and wellness for Black people. We need to establish a transit system that works. We need to make sure that there is access to work, to diverse infrastructure. When we're building the city, the streetscapes, we need to make sure that there is input of the entire community. Rural communities can be really unsafe, can be unsafe for a lot of people. I know that there were things that happened in the past where Black people couldn't go to certain areas after a certain time. There was even a specific name for it, the dawn of something, I can't remember, but learning that history, learning that history in high school, not from the school, but from conversations I was having with people, here in London, and people who lived in areas like Dorchester, left me a little bit, I get nervous around the rural communities. I want to make sure if I'm going there, I'm going at the daytime. I want to make sure that I have enough gas in my car, so I don't have to stop anywhere that might be dangerous for me. So when it comes to rural communities, especially in the surroundings of London, we really need to address a lot of hatred that has happened in these areas. I know that recently a mayor from, I think it was St. Mary's town, that's not too far from here, did post a past council meeting that was had to you know, a KKK council meeting. So these are things that we can't shy away from. When it comes to addressing anti-Blackness in rural communities, we have to face the dark history that's there. We have to call it out, and we have to make sure that everyone has a part to do. Doesn't matter how old you are, your gender, your sexuality, you can have a role to do in eradicating anti-Blackness in rural communities. And you know, another thing that I didn't mention on top of that is access to internet, access to information. A lot of people who live in rural communities do not have equal access to the internet and transit. So they can't even come to big cities if they want to. They shouldn't have to come to big cities to find work or to find health care or anything else that they need. They should be able to have those systems in place in rural communities, but it's not the case right now. So basically, eradicating anti-Blackness really benefits the community at large. It's as simple as that, because when we're eradicating the systemic discriminations against access to public services and to services in general, it benefits more than just one person. I know that not just Black people who live in rural communities can say that this is an issue for them. This access to internet is a huge issue. I work with some counselors on some boards who constantly have issues around accessing internet. You know, transit issue around rural communities, and it's not just a Black problem, it's a problem for the entire community. So when we're addressing these systemic problems and we are connecting the rural communities more to the bigger cities that are around them, then we can have more diverse people want to live in these areas. And if we can address also the past, because I always say that if you are sick and you want to get better, you can't get better if you don't know that you're sick. So you have to know that your city has a disease called racism in order for you to heal from the disease called racism. And it is okay to come out and say, these were my beliefs before. I have learned and I want to do better. I want to learn. Nobody's going to shun you from that. The whole purpose is to create an equity space for all of us. And I think Nyaboy said something earlier about treating us better. I was thinking about that today. Why are we teaching people to treat us better, to humanize us? They know how to humanize each other. They know how to treat each other nicely. Why do we have to teach people how to treat us better and how to treat us like a human being? We are human beings. We are resilient. We've been resilient. And I think that even the Black people who live in rural communities, I honestly kudos to them, because I couldn't do it. Just like Melvin and Colette said, when you're moving to a city, once you've experienced and lived the level of racism, one, you can't turn it out anymore. You can't zoom it out. This is not something that you just wake up and turn off or tune on. It's like, it's ongoing. And if it's not on the screen of your TV, it's on your street. It's on the way that, the city is designed. It's on the neighbors you have. It's on different things that we have to face as a community. So having these conversations, and I think that a lot of people are looking forward to what's next, what's next. And some of these conversations are getting somewhat weary, and they're heavy. They're heavy conversations. These are heavy stuff that we're talking about. But imagine how long we've had to live with this in silence. The other day was last month in June when I said I had never felt like I could be myself until June. I had never felt like I could walk in a room with fully my Blackness. And I'm a strong Black woman who is strong in her voice, strong in her truth, strong in who I am. But for so long, I always felt like I had to tone down my Blackness. I felt like I had to tone down my voice. I had to change. I have to switch how I talk when I walk in a room. And it's the first time in my life that I can say what I really think, and I don't have to worry about you being offended, because if you have to feel offended, then you have a lot of work to do within your heart. And I'm just simply asking for you to treat me like a human being I'm just simply asking for space to breathe and to live and be a human being. So rural communities have a lot of work to do. They have a lot of history to go through. They have a lot of healing a lot of diseases to heal, and then work at the system level in terms of policies and access to services that people need in their communities. But until they recognize that racism is present in their communities, they're not going to fix it. They're going to continue to live in a segregated world where they don't have to engage with Black people. And that's really unfortunate because they're missing out on a lot of things.
Thank you so much, Councillor Kayabaga. You mentioned a lot of points that were also mentioned earlier in regards to coming into spaces and wanting to know that there are people that look like you, people that have similar knowledges as you, people that have similar perspectives, and how that is so necessary, especially when going to live in a rural community. So I thank you. So next I'm going to ask Leroy. Anti-Black racism shows up in many different ways. How does one respond when it shows up as microaggressions in the workplace?
Well, it's quite interesting. It's no disgrace to be Black, but it's often very inconvenient. And I think that's James Weldon Johnson. But I mean, when you talk about racism and microaggressions, I think it's really important that it's not our job to solve it, because we did not create it. I think we actually have to have a partnership in this as far as dealing with it. Proximity breeds empathy, but distance breeds suspicion. So this whole idea of called microaggressions, for those that don't know, because I don't know who's also watching, but microaggressions, the word micro means small, macro is large. It's those small comments people make throughout the course of somebody's life that look similar to myself, that affects them on a daily basis. So for example, I went to a high school. I think it was an elementary school not too long ago. And I wanted to go talk to the principal. I was dressed in a suit and tie, probably different suit, different tie. So I walk into the school, walk into the office, and I said to the administrative assistant, "May I speak with the principal, please?" So she said, "He's just finishing his lunch. If you just want to have a seat, he'll come and get to you." So I said, "No problem." So I sat down and just thought in my cognitive domain what I need to tell this gentleman, because I do not want to waste his time. So as he walked up to me, I walked up to him, I shook his hand, I said, "Hi, my name is Leroy, nice to meet you. I work at such and such organization. We have some very interesting programs that we can benefit your school, students, possibly staff." Then the principal looked at me and he said, "You know what? You speak really good English. Where are you from?" And then he asked me if I played basketball. So I paused momentarily and I said, "What just happened?" So I didn't get upset with him. I didn't attack him because he has his lived experience as well. But then I don't want to be the angry Black man. So for people of color, we always have to think a future in interactions with people present, because we're leaving a trace for those that are coming behind. So I just paused and I said, "Well, my parents," I think I said my parents from Jamaica, but then I thought into my mind, I don't think English is you have to be from a certain country to speak it. It's a kind of a universal language. I thought that. But how I handle that is this: with microaggressions, before I make accusations, I ask a question. So I don't accuse the person, I ask the person. So if somebody makes a comment towards me, I'll pause and I'll ask them a question like, "Why did you say that?" Or "What did you mean by that?" They would have to come and defend themselves based on the comment they made towards me or someone else. Because for some strange reason, as you can probably find out, nobody wants to be accused of being a racist person. And people do that a lot, as far as they always try to convince you that they're not when situations do arise. So as far as microaggressions for myself personally, a lot of times I ask questions and I do my best not to accuse, because I think when I ask a question and they respond to that question, then I have a better sense on how to go about helping them in a situation. That's basically.
Thank you, Leroy. That's great. You've got some really good catchphrases that I was really scribbling down, but the one that speaks to me the most is actually the first thing you said, which is that it's not our job to solve racism because we did not create it. And when I think about what Melvin was saying about what being an ally is like, where it is self-interrogation and self-examination, I think that is the start of realizing, you know, what is everyone's part in moving forward. Yeah, boy, we're gonna go through our last round of questioning. That sounds really, I didn't mean it that way. I mean, we're gonna go through a last round where everyone is asked a different question because from the audience. I'm gonna start with Nyaboy. In recognizing that there is a lack of Black and Indigenous people of color knowledges, experiences, and history taught in classrooms, what are the long-term effects of this? And how can schools begin to effectively diversify and be more inclusive within the curriculum?
Thank you for the question. I think what it comes down to is, when it comes to education, I don't think nothing is accidental. I think things are done on purpose. So the question is, the group of people you've mentioned, are we there to be truly educated, or are we there to be programmed? I mean, do they really want us to learn so we can become the best we can in the society that we live in, or are we just meeting a quota? So I think those things have to be ironed out first, because if the intent is that I'm meant to be truly educated within the Canadian system, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. It would already be a reality within the textbooks, within the curriculum and whatnot. But it's not there, because the intention is not for me to be truly educated as a Black person. The intent is for me to understand, I guess, white supremacy and how it benefits this country and how we're under white rule. That's what I'm meant to learn. And that's how I'm meant to be conditioned to survive in that world. That world, I'm being educated to survive in it and to navigate through it. I'm not educated to dismantle it. So to tell our education system to add our history is to say, we're dismantling the root of all of our issues. And I don't think they're ready for that yet, because the long-term effect of not knowing who you are, obviously, is low self-esteem, not having a sense of direction, not having a sense of purpose, not moving through the world like a complete stranger. It's almost like you're stateless, you're homeless, like you're just there, just floating around. You don't know who you are. And that we become part of the industry where everybody else benefits from our issues. So do they really want us to be fully functioning human beings that can prosper in this nation? And from my own opinion, I don't think so. And that's why it will be very tough to have proper history told the way that it should told. Like, for example, if tomorrow we were to change the curriculum, we would have to start with this whole Columbus thing, how apparently he discovered the Americas, but he really didn't do that. So if Indigenous kids grow up knowing that this is the land of my ancestors put up a fight, they did A, B, C, D, and E before the land was conquered or taken away, then you would have a different narrative and a different view of your indigeneity when you know that it was systematically done. It wasn't just settlers in the Americas who did their stuff and got away with it. They had support from all European states. So if you understood as an Indigenous child, then you won't have certain attitudes and beliefs about yourself and about your people, because you would know that the whole wide world worked together to make sure that your sovereignty was undermined. Then you would have high self-esteem. Then you would do things to better the nation that you live in. But the idea is, everybody else who is not white within the education system, we are meant to be serving white people and their children. That is the ultimate goal. So for us to be educated properly, where we can have actual power and actual agency and actual, voice, that's not really the intention. Because I came here as a refugee from Ethiopia, and I went to school from the age of 8, and right now I'm 26. So I've been in school. I've been in the educational system for the past 18 years, and I have like really, really tough conversations with my teacher, because I remember one time they were playing like a movie, I think it was called To Kill a Mockingbird, and one of the scenes, and I was the only Black kid in my class, and one of the scenes, I don't know. I think it's a book. So we're reading the book To Kill a Mockingbird. In one of the chapters, they kept saying the N-word, and the teacher kept saying it. And I asked her, "I'm the only Black kid in the class, but you have no problem describing my people in derogatory terms without seeking my permission." And she said, "Why should I seek your permission? It's in the book, so I'm allowed to say it." But I'm like, "I'm the only Black person, the only dark-skinned person in the class, and you are saying things that if I was a Jew, you wouldn't say." And she just completely she didn't care. And so what I learned that is they're free to do anything and say anything because we are not the target audience when it comes to being properly educated. So for us to advocate and say, no, I want Indigenous people of color center education where our collective history can be told, you're literally dismantling everything. Because sometimes when we talk about dismantling, we think about, oh, I gotta get tiki torches and get a big army. That's not what it's about. Information is power. And the white world that cannot exist, cannot prosper without people of color. It was us that brought them to this point. So to teach proper education, to teach our collective history. But the issue is, what direction as Canadians are we going? Are we going towards a more truly inclusive society, or are we going toward a society that is settler based, and we're just like the servant serving the master? So we have to be honest about the foundation of our society, and we have to be honest about the thing we call education. What is the target audience, and why are we getting educated in the way that we're getting educated? So it's a huge thing. So I think for me personally, I went through school learning about white people and dead white people, living white people and whatnot. I never learned about anybody Black being great in history until I had to pick up a book on my own outside of school to learn about myself. Because if I know about who I am, then you can't really taunt me with racism. You can't really taunt me with colorism. You can't do anything to me without my consent. So if you can't break my self-esteem, then where would white supremacy have a room to live? It would have no space. So white supremacy needs our consent to thrive. Without our consent, who will they be great against? Because the way I look at racism is like, okay, when you're racist, it's your own internal conflict. Why do I have to be the recipient? Why do I have to be the one receiving it? I really do not care that you're white, you're pink, you're blue, you're whatever. That's up to you. However the creator made you, that's how he wanted to make you, right? So who are you to dictate how I maneuver because of the shade of my skin? So education frees us from these type of dogmas and these type of narratives. And if you are a white colonialist master or elitist, you do not want proper education. Because if every white child and every Black child and every Indigenous child can get along and see history for what it really is, then Canada can turn into a society that is truly, truly multicultural, truly, truly inclusive. But if that's not the true intent of the people who govern us, then it's going to be a fight to have proper education. Because at the end of the day, I believe the society we live in, nothing is done by accident. Everything is done on purpose because they look at the long term, the short term, and whatnot. But we, people of color, with this big term, we have to be as strategic as well. Because I'm not going to live the rest of my life feeling sorry for myself, feeling inferior because you have conditioned me to be inferior. Like, it's like even like at this point at my life, I get white people getting mad at me because I'm not reacting to them the way they would expect a Black person to react to them. I'll just give a quick example before I go. So I had a white police officer ask me where I was from, like in Africa, like my tribe. And so instead of answering, I asked him, what's your tribe? I mean, you have a tribe, so what's yours? And then he's like, okay, let me think about it. I've never been asked that before. But I'm like, this idea of whiteness as we know it today is a construct. It doesn't exist. It's not a real thing. You have a tribe, you have a subclan, you have a house name, you have a family name. What is it? So, he gave me a country, Microaggressions, and Apple and Saxon. He's like, now I got to go home and do my own research. So in that moment, I made him accountable to be like, listen, stop looking to me as an African person to be the hub of tribalism. You are a tribal people. Look at Canada. We're here because of tribalism. true people who are white, the French and the English, we fought their wars for so many years because of tribalism. That's why we're here today, right? Talking about it. We're talking English. So one tribe won over the other tribe. That's why I'm speaking English right now, and I'm not Francophone, because one tribe defeated the other. So when it comes to tribalism, when it comes to colorism, when it comes to racism, if you look at what we call whiteness, they have it bad, because when you can abuse another, it means you have abused yourself first. Before you came in for my color, you dissected who is white, who isn't white enough, who's white-ish, who's white. You figure that out within your own society. But you want to give me this narrative that I'm the problem, I have the colorism issue, I have the tribalism, when you, with your narratives and your books and your systemic way of doing things, you have dissected whiteness in a way that we don't even understand the people of color, because we're not that invested in your world. So it's just that what I tend to do in my life is just like I flip things, because when someone comes to me with their isms and their issues, I fully understand that it's not about me, it's about them and how they feel. But they need my consent to feel the way they feel. If I do not consent that dark skin is bad, then what does it mean to be white? If I love my dark skin, then what does it mean to be white? If my skin is divine, then what does it mean to be white? So you need me to be, for you to exist. I'm the contrast to your bullshit. I'm sorry to say that there, but I'm the contrast. You need me to be a certain way so you can exist in a certain way. I'm the devil so you can be the angel. But if I'm divine, then what are you? So I think these are the conversations that we would have if we had proper education. So as someone who understands her roots, who understands where she comes from, who understands how the society functions, you can't tell me, oh, you're A, B, C, D, and E. It's like what it comes down to is this: my existence, my DNA predates whiteness, predates European states, predates colonialism, predates nation states. So how can you tell me who I am when I predate your existence? And that's a scientific fact. So how can you tell me who I am when I was around before you were even around? When it was my continent that you came to come get my stuff. I didn't leave to go get your stuff. You came and got my stuff. So that's what education does. It flips the narrative. We get to have a real conversation. And the real conversation does not make you look as powerful as you would want to look. So you have to make sure that I'm being fed what you want me to know. Because at this point in my life, I'm divine, I'm good. If you come to me and say, oh, I don't agree with that, then I'll say, you have your own skin color, go deal with it the way you want to go deal with it. I am not here to just be a recipient of the white world. I create my own. So education, proper education, would free our minds. And when our minds are free, then we no longer become prisoners in our own skins. And when we're no longer prisoners, we can create systems and society that reflects what we call humanity. And we're not ready to be human yet. That's a fact. We're not ready to be human. We want to continue nursing these traumas. We want to continue living in a system, in a place where things are systematically done that we are more animalistic than human. And it's done on purpose. We're living on the lower plane. It's done on purpose. And that's what education does into society. You learn ways to be inferior. You learn ways to worship whiteness, because that's the intent. True education would mean that whether you're indigenous, you're Black, or you're white, that you're okay as you are. But if your education is dependent on my inferiority complex, then it's not about education, it's about indoctrination. So I'll stop it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, your boy. I see Ariel, did you want to say something to that?
I just want to hold the space for your boy for what she just said. I think let it not go over your head. What your boy just said is very powerful, and I want us to just reflect on that before we jump to the next thing, because And I understand we have, you know, time we're working with and protocols and everything, but she's talking about something that's really important, our education system. And I have seen it. It came out of the Black Lives Matter movement, request. It was there before, you know, we started trending. Lots of people have talked about this. And we haven't moved the dial, you know, we haven't moved the dial. And even when the dial moves, it moves so small that you think you're conquering, but you're not really conquering, because at the end of the day, there are still layers of policies, of systemic stuff just suffocating the education around Indigenous and Black history. And I want to hold that space for her, because she said it so eloquently. And, you know, I want us to talk about that, because that's the conversation. Those are the conversations we need to have. You know, many people keep asking, what can we do? What is it that we can support people with? These are the conversations we need to have. We need support in changing the education system. You know, I went to high school in, I'm going to say about 10 years ago, about 10 years ago or 11 years ago. And we were learning, we weren't learning, but we were participating in Black History Month. I hated Black History Month when it came around, because it was all about slavery. And, you know, it's like, I already know about slavery. Like, we don't want to celebrate, you know, and you know, I will continue to honor the ancestors that have come in the past. But our history is more than that. And when we talk about, you know, slavery in school systems, we're not talking about the resilience of the people who fought through racism. We're not talking about, I had never heard about the number of people that Harriet Tubman delivered herself up until I saw her movie, because it's not really talked about. It's high level stuff. She freed herself and freed a couple of people. No, she delivered 750 slaves, removed them from slavery. And those people had to have mental resilience to be able to come out of that slavery. So we too have to have the mental resilience to combat the systemic racism that we're facing right now. And we can't just jump over that. I know that we have questions to answer, but I really want us to comment on and I want to hear from some of our powerful leaders in our community to comment on what she just mentioned, because it's very powerful. And education is huge into the way that we treat racism. And I can, even talking about policy at this point is relevant when we can't talk about education and the way that indoctrination happens at the school level and the mental health, you know, the issues that come mentally for youth, for people, the disease that come from carrying such a burden of not really learning your true history, because racism is not our history. It's an interruption to our history. It's other people's history. It's not ours, because ours has been interrupted for so long. And we're still saying, can we talk about our history? Can we share our history? Because we haven't had the space to do that. So I want us, and I apologize, you know, Emanuela, for doing this, but I think I can see Colette wants to say something. I can see everybody's nodding and they want to say something. I think we should hold the space on that.
Well, I won't be long, just brief, but Naiboy, when you were talking, I kept thinking of two things. Miseducation of the Negro and the wretched of the earth by Frantz Fanon. Those were the two things that kept coming through my mind when you were talking. The other part, Ariel, what you said, like, this fight is nothing new in terms of education and wanting our history. The one thing I'm sick and tired of seeing, years ago, when I was in Montreal, we had the Quebec Board of Black Educators, and they put out a book called Some Missing Pages, which was about the history related to Black people and Canada, all the history that you're not told. But time and time again, you see this thing when it comes to our history, we're always optional, right? Nothing is ever mandatory, right? We do training through our system, the child welfare system, right? Some of the things are optional, right? Black history is optional, right? So it's going to be incumbent someplace that these things are not optional, but they're part of your curriculum. And I will agree with Naya Boy with that, right? I think if I think if people actually made that a mandatory thing, a mandatory course, you will see an increase in self-esteem, right? You might see a decrease in mental health as well. You may see a decrease in behaviors with children. You might see children wanting to go to school to learn. And I don't think that is what is wanted, right? Certainly I think that's what's wanted on individual cases, but I think on a system scale, that is completely different, right? So, but I just wanted to say, Naya Boy, those were the two books that kept going through my head.
But I'm going to go to Melvin next and ask him to reflect on that, and then Leroy to bring us to a close. But I just wanted you, can you just repeat those two books, just in case people in the audience wanted to write that down?
Yeah, Melvin, help me here. Miseducation of the Negro. Was it Carter? I can't remember the name of the author, but it was Miseducation of the Negro.
Yes, yes.
Carter Goodson, was it that it?
I believe so. And you said what, Wretched of the Earth by
Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon. I think he did also, what is it? Black face, white mask.
Black skin, white mask.
Black skin, white mask. Frantz Fanon. FRANTZ FANON.
Yes. Absolutely essential reading.
So Melvin, yes, I'll have you comment on that.
I think just briefly, I think Naiboy should really hit it on the head for me. I think a couple pieces. I think one of the things that we've that you've learned, that you will learn on this journey of self-investigation and being a seeker of light and a seeker of truth, is that I think the West, as we know it, the epistemology or the philosophy which governs everything in the West is based and it's grounded on the existence of the dichotomy, meaning everything is an opposition to something else, right? So from religion to politics to the social construct, everything is in opposition to everything else. And those in-between spaces and those third spaces and fourth and fifth spaces become subversive, or they become subversive within the West, right? And it's within traditional institutions, whether it's indigenous institutions or African institutions, where those third spaces are often, and those fourth spaces are often allowed to exist. Okay, everything around us is you have black, white, right? You have heaven, hell. You have left, right, right? You have the political left. You have the political right, right? It's those in between spaces that doesn't exist. So I think from that initial piece is that, are we prepared as a society and as a culture? Because that act of dismantling or even trying to see those in between spaces is very, very difficult. It's very, very difficult, and for many people, it can be traumatic. It's like you're tearing down everything I've ever known, everything I've ever understood, right? But in order to be set free, in many ways, those are the kind of coming back to it again. That's the kind of death, in many ways, that the people that as a society we perhaps have to go through. But it is, everything within Western society is based on the existence of the dichotomy, and everything is built on that foundation, right? And it makes it very difficult for alternative thought, alternative action to actually exist.
Thank you for that, Melvin. Leroy, please let me know if you want to touch on it as well.
Okay. Well, I think it's important, education, because I think in Canada, people still think Africa is a country. So I think, the greatest way people give up their power is thinking that they don't have any. And I think what we have to do is what you're saying, in addition to making this infused in the curriculum and putting money behind it. I mean, when you reach into your wallet, because money is important to people, but it lets us know that you're actually thoroughly invested in furthering the education of our children and what we want to do. So it's a time in which, I mean, it's a work in progress, but I believe that, you know, if you don't know who you are, anybody will give you an identity. And if you don't know where you're going, any word is going to lead you there. And if you don't know what you want, you will accept anything. So I think this is what's taking place in our communities right now. So, but I mean, I completely agree as far as education is a very, very important tool to help understand who we are as a people. I mean, I went to school here, you know, with Black History Month. I never knew anything about that as well. Elementary, high school, whatnot, and it was almost like an add-on. And then when you had Black History Month, it was a lot of it was just singing and dancing, very performative. But as far as consciousness, you know, people say, "Oh, you're a good singer. Oh, that was a deep song." And thank you, but we are also more of a people than that as well, even though that's part of our background and what we can do as in a community. So I think having a well-rounded system and a well-rounded view of the persons and what we have contributed to this nation is really, really important.
Can I say one more thing just to add on to Leroy? I won't take time, but I know why we have Black History Month and stuff, don't get me wrong. But the fact that we just have to have Black History Month, right? So when you talk to people who are in the Caribbean, right? This is not necessarily the case because you're surrounded by your people, right? So the fact that, so you have your doctor, you have your this, you have your that. These are not things to be wowed about, right? Because it's your environment. So the fact that you then come here and there has to be a creation of Black History Month should tell you there's an issue. That's all.
Yeah, no, that's true. I think, you know, we've been here a long time, and I think people need to recognize that.
Thank you, everyone. That was incredible. I'm going to do a job that is impossible, which is to talk about some key things that have transpired. I wanted to just stop before that, though, and I wanted to thank Councillor Kayabaga for getting us to stop for a second and breathe and think about what just happened, because you know, the first time now before we talked, I said that I was getting a whole new education. I have degrees, so that's really saying something. And then when the last time she talked and started to tell me about education, you know, I mean, that's something that in my 3 degrees in education, I have never learned about. And so I wanted to thank you, Councillor Kayabaga, for stopping and helping us just take stock of what just happened and what we could learn, and then allowing everyone to respond to that. I'm gonna go and I just highlight, I've got a book here, and I'm gonna just read out a few quotes that I highlighted from what people have said today.
Melanie?
Yes.
Sorry to cut you. Before you do that, I know that we didn't get to the last questions, right? But
yes.
The last question was, what is it that people can do to hold their elected officials accountable? When you have some time, I'd like to add a sentence in there.
You want to go now?
Sure. So the question for me was, when it comes to policy, how can the community be involved in the most effective way in encouraging city councils and committees to become anti-racist? So my answer to that is engage them, hold them accountable 100%. And I'm putting myself up in that group as well, because I'm elected and I'm sitting at that table. And engage everyone who's elected in the city, not just city councilors. You have MPPs, you have MPs. They're all responsible to make sure that the policies that are being passed have an anti-racism lens to it, to make sure that every single service area at the City of London is implementing anti-racism lens to what they do. Engineering, street building, infrastructure, planning is the biggest one, planning. But most importantly, the budget. How does the budget reflect anti-racism? This is where the money, most people want to talk about anti-racism, eradicating it, but nobody wants to put money behind it. The minute money's talked about, then we go back to this. If it's at the foundation of how the budget is created, anti-racism is included into budget creation, then we can start seeing things be done differently. Like Leroy just mentioned, we're not just going to do the education piece and not talk about the money. The money is the biggest part of everything that we do, allocation of money. And if a city has, the City of London has a diversity and inclusion plan. They've been working on it for a couple of years. We still don't have metrics to track that. We still don't include it. There's no lens over it when we're allocating budget. Gender and race are not included in the way that we allocate our budget. So we're having these conversations about, defunding the police or reallocating the police funds or SROs and all that kind of stuff. All that stuff is being talked about because we are not really paying attention to how money is being allocated throughout the city. And this is where people really need to be engaged and learn and use your power and privilege to support Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities that are asking money to be put in the right places. It will build healthy communities. It would build better lives for everyone. And it's not just going to be Black people and Indigenous people that advantage from this. It's going to be the entire city. So basically, if you choose not to be racist, you're going to have a healthier community. That's what I'm saying.
Thank you, Councillor Kayabaga. Does anyone else want to give a call to action before I do wrap up?
I think one of the things people have to understand is not to be silent, right? I think people talked about it. Everyone seems to be aware of what's going on right now. So people need to get active. People need to speak up. Being silent is very complicit, especially once you're aware of what is going on. And you might even go to, since you're writing down nice little quips there, Melanie, silence is violence.
Thank you. Melvin, Leroy, or Nyaboy, call to action?
Yeah, I think quickly, I think just going back to some things that were said, I always remember my first Black History Month here in London was I attended the meeting, and the former mayor Matt Brown spoke about the welcome tree, and it was the first time I ever heard about the welcome tree here in London. So when I think the story went is when as escaped slaves, or when they had arrived in Canada, that there was this welcome tree where they knew that you had reached safety, right? And that was right here in the I think this the city of London. And I was amazed how within a year, the next mayor coming in, who spoke at the same Black History Month, that piece had been lost from the narrative of. So our piece in the Black History Month address was lost. And for me, it's amazing how quickly something like that can be erased from the narrative of a city, the narrative of a space, and the narrative from a community. You know what I mean? Listen, if we look at history, we understand that Blacks were in this country before the British. Okay, so let that marinate for a minute, right? We came here in 1608. 1608. So Matthew da Costa was a translator for the French, who was a translator between the French and the Mi'kmaq. He was not a slave, he was a free man. So 1608, we have been here. Okay, so for me, this like, and it is absolutely amazing. There are parts of our history that are hidden, that are kept in secret places and secret spaces. Listen, I worked in Nunavut for 5 years, and there is an amazing community in Nunavut called Whale Cove. I'm going to give them a bit of a shout out, where what people don't know is Jamaican whalers, it's called Whale Cove. Jamaican whalers used to go to Whale Cove up in Nunavut, and they had families, and they had wives, and they had children. This was since the 1800s. Okay, you know what I mean? So it is. So you have this community in Nunavut that has descendants of these Jamaican whalers, right? So the things I'm always amazed in terms of we have been, and we are part of this space. Our history is part of this space. Our West African legends and tales of a Nancy the Spider and the Trickster are part of this space and its overall narrative at the exact same time. So I think so for me, I think at the end of the day, the two solitudes that we've been taught and brought up of French and English, those are things of the past, right? Because if we look at history and we understand and we learn our history, then we were actually here before the British. And I think what is amazing, especially about Canada and the idea of slavery, is that we don't like to look at that particular past. But everyone forgets, wait a second, we were a British colony and the British had slaves. So that means we had slaves. So slavery existed. No one makes that connection. And it's amazing. We have those trappings of colonization as part of our national narrative. Parliament, the Queen, Governor General, so on and so forth. But those ugly parts in terms of slavery and those institutions, right? And the systemic racism that still exists today as a result of colonization, those are the pieces of the narrative we want to conveniently set aside and brush aside, right? And we seem to be unable to make that connection, that part of that colonial exercise on this space, right? On these traditional lands included slavery as an institution. So I think we really have to make an effort to learn about these things and to teach them. And again, it's like our history is negated for those within school, but then all of a sudden you teach Black history in February, right? And thank God I went to an alternative high school in Toronto where we got to set the curriculum, right? We chose the books that we wanted to read. We determined how we were graded for our assignments. We determined how we were marked, if we gave one big paper, if we gave five smaller papers. So alternatives exist, right? So, and I think we have to look towards those alternative narratives that exist to really fill in the gaps that are all around us. Okay.
Thank you, Melvin. Namboy or Leroy, did you want to give one final call to action?
I'll just have a sentence. I'll just say African or Black history is world history. Without it, nothing of the world would make sense, because we are the foundation. So I think anyone who wants to be an ally or anyone who is of African descent, yeah, we need to also educate ourselves, because sometimes we're like white men with like dark skin. We're not different mentally from the people who oppress us. So we need to educate ourselves. That's our own duty. And also people that are allies, they really need to educate themselves as well. So I think if we can just accept that African history, Black history is world history, without it, that no one else would exist. If we can accept that, then things would kind of make sense. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Namboy. And Leroy, you're always last. Now you have the last word.
No, that's okay. Just to agree with everybody else, but as well, those that are supporting our community, if you can do this, this will be very helpful. Don't prove you're not a racist. Just be anti-racist.
Thank you, Leroy. Don't prove you're not a racist, just be anti-racist. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to skip my recap. I'm going to hand it over to Dobi Joki to wrap up tonight.
Thank you so much to the panelists. I personally learned from all of you today, and I think it was so important for this conversation to happen and to have this diverse panel to discuss your perspectives and contribute to this conversation. One of the things I want to mention is that, you know, this conversation might be uncomfortable for some people, and it should be, because that's where it starts, the discomfort. It was also discussed that, you know, it's important to check our internal biases and internalize all of this information. And I think that's another piece that we need to tap into, especially those who consider themselves allies. And the topic of education, I think it's really important for us to remember that this conversation, this dialogue that we're having right now is education. Nia Boy started the conversation on the education system in Canada. And as an education student, I recognize that Nelson Mandela once said, education is the most powerful weapon which we can use to change the world. And I know in my master's research, I said, education is the most powerful weapon we can use to mislead, misguide, and misinform the world. And this is exactly what we've experienced here in Canada. So I think that's an important point to mention. And lastly, this was part, as I mentioned, part of the education. Now the duty for everyone watching, those allies and Black folks who are also learning about themselves, is to go and do that internal work. And so again, I thank all of the panelists. I thank Melanie Ann for supporting me in hosting this and having this conversation with the panelists. And the next City Symposium will be on September 14th, 2020. And the topic and theme will be no poverty. Melanie Ann, did you want to touch?
Sure, yeah. So if you wanted to stay in touch with us, sign up for updates at citysymposium.com for the most current information. And now I'm going to do my traditional role of thanking everybody who made this happen. So I wanted to, oh my gosh. So there was a point, I'm actually glad that we took that pause, because there's a point in which I was so overwhelmed with how much learning was happening. I teared up and almost started crying. So I thank you that I got that chance to pause, because like I said, 5 degrees, never been educated like this. And something I wanted to touch on what Dobi Joki said was that the diversity of the panel. And I really want everybody watching to really just think about what she just said there, that, you know, on the surface, right, if you saw our pictures, you would say, oh, what a homogeneous panel. But I really hope that you have all been listening tonight, because it was quite a diverse panel in the views that were expressed and the directions that they were able to take, similar on the surface concepts. And I think it is due to what Melvin was saying about those third spaces. That is where you find, right, where we need to go next with this. So yes, it was uncomfortable, but boy, was it learning that I needed. And I hope that it was something that you felt as well. So once again, thank you, Colette, Nyaboy, Leroy, Councillor Kayabaga, and Melvin. Thank you, little brother, Matthew. That was great. Thank you to all the organizations that made this series possible. Urban League of London, London Community Foundation, Polish Up Cannon and Steel, London Arts Council. Thank you to the Faculty of Health Sciences at Western University, especially the Center for Research on Health Equity and Social Inclusion, the Health Equity in Context Interdisciplinary Development Initiative, and the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at Western, specifically the Master of Media and Journalism and Communication program. And thank you, Juan Bello, for all your work producing these videos for this series. I've got a few more thank yous left. I wanted to say thank you very much to the rest of our partners. That includes London Public Library, Aeolian Hall, Museum London, the Grand Theatre, Pillar Nonprofit Network, Western University Students' Council, Fanshawe Students' Union, City of London. And thank you, Dobi Joki. This was your idea. This was your concept. You are the one who made this happen. And I'm so very, very grateful that you brought this to our city, because this is exactly what we needed tonight.
Thank you all so much. And for those 300 people who stayed on about 30 minutes extra to have us continue the conversation and really get all the knowledge that we needed from it. So again, thank you panelists, thank you audience, and we will see you on September 14th. Take care.